Good evening all and welcome. Tonight I have a collection of haunted wood stories for you, so get comfortable and let the darkness take control. This happened to me when I was 12 years old. My friend Ali had come over to hang out and we were just playing outside. We had also invited our friend Giselle from school over to join us. She was always fascinated by the paranormal, as she claimed she saw ghosts and other entities in her house, just like my house, which had been haunted for as long as they could remember. My house had a fenced area, but it borders the woods that span for miles and miles. Our nearest neighbor was directly across the street, and there is a house next to theirs not too far. Giselle told Ali and me that she felt the whole entire block might be haunted, and wanted to explore the forest to see if there was anything. Mind you, we had played several times in this forest, but we just hadn't gone too far. I reluctantly agreed, looking at Ali with one of those, "oh gosh," stares. Ali looked at me, seemingly agreeing, and said to Giselle, "If anything happens, you're to blame." We all laughed and agreed we were going in, where we had never gone before. I went to tell my mum as Giselle and Ali headed to the entrance of the forest. When I told her, she got pissed because she didn't want me to be too far. I told her I'd be fine and that I was with my friends. Bear in mind this was back in '99, so it was before everyone had cell phones, and I got angry with her because I felt like she was trying to baby me, which I never liked, and stormed out. Now I have siblings, but they're older and they were doing their own thing, and my other sister was only 5 at the time, so I wasn't exactly going to bring her along. When I got outside, I noticed Ali and Giselle were gone. I thought they were going to be waiting for me at the entrance, but they had gone on ahead of me, which really ticked me off. I made my way into the forest, but something seemed off today. I wasn't hearing the typical birds or forest sounds I always heard. The only thing I was surrounded by was dead silence. I started to get that eerie feeling like I was being watched. It scared me deeply, but I figured I would be in the company of Ali and Giselle just before long, so I kept going. As I was walking, I thought I heard leaves crunching behind me, but when I looked, there was not a soul in sight. I called out to Ali and Giselle, but got no reply. Where could they be? I decided to keep going. I walked and walked, getting deeper into the woods, and I couldn't find them for the life of me. And that's when I heard someone call out. I was surprised when I turned around to see a boy who I'd never seen before, standing at about 50 feet from me, who appeared to be my age, but possibly a little older. "Do I know you?" I asked in a nervous voice. I had never seen this boy, or was aware of there being a boy around my age in this neighborhood. "You don't, but are you having trouble finding your friends? I can help," I recall him saying. Now this boy looked out of place, being that it was 1999. His clothes looked old, like, upon reflection, 1940s style. Even his hair looked weird for 1999. And how did this kid know I was looking for my friends? I began to get this overwhelming anxiety. I began to feel weak and my legs were trembling. "You're a really pretty looking 12-year-old. If you take my hand, I can guide you." That's when he looked down. I backed up. Not knowing what was about to happen, I was scared. At that moment, I really wished I had listened to my mum. Then he looked right up at me. His eyes were completely white, no color. I could only see the sclera, no eye color or anything. They looked lifeless. That was when I just lost it. I ran past him, and he had this disgusting grin that made me feel sick as I passed him. Whatever this boy was, I didn't know, and when I was around 20 feet away, I looked back, and he was gone. He had just vanished into thin air. There wasn't really anywhere he could have gone that I wouldn't have seen or heard him, and I began to cry and ran for my life until I was out the forest. When I got back to my house, I ran inside, only to find Giselle and Ali sitting at the kitchen table. I started screaming at them, demanding to know where they had been when I literally had just gone through what felt like the whole forest. But it turned out they had been waiting for me, but they got distracted with something and we somehow missed each other. I was hysterical. They tried comforting me and asking me what was wrong, but I never answered them. I knew they weren't going to believe me, and after that happened, I would never go into that forest again. I don't know what I encountered that day, but I don't want to know. I didn't tell anyone until I confided in Ali many years later, before she passed away. She was shocked and knew there was always something malicious about that forest. I won't even let my own son Caleb in there. I haven't told him either, but he started saying that he's interested in going in there, even at 15. If he asks me to go in there, I'm not sure if I'll allow it. For the most part, I think it's off limits for both of us, but perhaps I'm exaggerating. In any case, I don't want to go anywhere near that place again. About 5 years ago, I was going to visit my maternal grandparents with my mum. It was summer, and they lived in the absolute middle of nowhere, so I had nothing to do and wasted my time. I mean, I enjoyed their company, don't get me wrong, but I wanted to explore, so I decided to just go for a drive by myself. The closest was this mountain road, which intrigued me, and so off I went by myself. I was getting a bit carried away and doing some crappy drifting and just enjoying the mountain pass. After driving for a while, I rounded a corner and suddenly I saw a person in the middle of the road. The thing is, there was no way I could avoid them, and I hit them. In a total panic, I stopped the vehicle and drove back to the spot. My heart was beating out of my chest, and I thought I would die of a heart attack from the stress. But when I reached the spot where I hit the person, there was nothing. I got out and inspected the car. There was no damage, no scratches, no blood on the car, and nothing on the road. I was absolutely crapping myself. That's when I tried to remember. There was no sound or impact. I just knew that that person was there, and a moment later my car was going through them. It left a really bad taste in my mouth, and I forced myself to believe it was just a dream and went back to my grandparents' house. The next night came as expected, and as before, there was still nothing to do. The thoughts of the night before were really starting to get to me, so to try and make my peace with it, I once again ventured into the mountains to try and find the same pass and see if there was anything different to yesterday. This whole area is covered in loads of foliage, and the specific area where this happened was covered in a huge forest. There were almost no cars passing as I went, and the whole pass was quiet and eerie. When I finally got to the place and left my car, nothing had changed, and at that moment, I felt relief wash over me. After all, if I had hit something, my life would be over. And I got in the car with a sense of relief and drove down the pass. That's when an uneasy feeling came over me. I lit a cigarette and glanced in the rearview mirror, but something felt off. I felt eyes on the back of my head, and a shiver go all the way up my spine. I looked away, then looked at the rearview mirror again. There were eyes glaring at me through the mirror. I immediately took my eyes off the mirror and drove through the mountain pass without looking at the rearview mirror again. There were no other cars on this road, and I just kept driving. I still shiver when I think about that situation, and when I finally made it close to where my grandparents live, I went to a convenience store. Maybe the eyes were just a dream. I went to my grandparents' house and was relieved when I turned the engine off. I sat in the car for a moment, just collecting my thoughts. The oppressive silence that comes from being in the middle of nowhere filled my ears, and it was just a relief to hear nothing. When out of that silence I hear a faint voice say to me, "You will die soon." I knew I heard it. It wasn't a dream. Instinctively I turned around. I could feel the breath on my ear as the words were spoken. And of course there was nothing. It didn't take more than 3 seconds for me to exit my vehicle, slam it closed, and run into my grandparents' house. It was at that point I couldn't keep it in anymore, and I told my mother everything. She was skeptical and didn't believe me one little bit, and I returned home the next day. Even after returning home, the inside of the car still had a deeply unpleasant feeling to it. I just couldn't shake it. I wanted to buy a new car but simply didn't have the money. So I visited a so-called psychic to have a look at it. I didn't really give them the specifics. They had a look at the car and told me I was possessed by the spirit of a young man who had died in an accident. They didn't give me much more information, but with that I was already somewhat impressed. Apparently this malicious spirit wanted me to perish along with them. So I asked for them to please rid me of the spirit, and it was no cheap fee, a lot more money than I thought it would be. But I reluctantly agreed, and I'm glad to say that after that my car felt a hell of a lot lighter, and I haven't seen the creepy eyes or heard anything since, and I hope to keep it that way. There's no way I'll be venturing remote mountain passes in deep forest again for a long time. I live in the southwest of the UK. Years ago, when I was around 17, I got kicked out by my mum, who I was living with, because we had an argument, and I wandered the streets that night trying to stay awake. I asked friends if I could stay with them, but that wasn't really an option, unfortunately. At the time, I lived in a relatively new suburban area, so I decided to walk into the nearby woods that overlooked some farmland, hoping to watch the stars and find a place to sleep at around 2 a.m. There was a large wooded area near some flats, and I crawled through a thicket which led to an open space. As I walked through, it was pitch black, and I thought this would be a nice, safe area to try and sleep. As I laid down, suddenly I heard footsteps. They sounded heavy and loud, and it sounded like they were circling me. I froze and asked if anyone was there, but the footsteps got faster and faster, pacing around me. Then I heard a deep growl. It sounded big. I panicked and ran away through the thicket and onto the street. At the time, I had about £100 in my bank account, so I wandered to a nearby hotel to see if I could get a room, but they wouldn't let me in. I was cold, desperate, and scared, so I walked to a nearby 24-hour shop, bought some snacks, a torch, and made my way back to the thicket. This time I was armed with light, and when I returned to the wood I heard the footsteps again. I quickly turned on the torch, shining it all around, looking from where the footsteps were coming from, but I couldn't see anything. Then I heard the growl again. It was deep and reverberating. It sounded like it was right next to me. I could hear it but not see it, but it sounded so big. But no matter how much I shone the torch, I could not see what was making the noise. I ran away to the nearby bus stop and spent the night there, awake but scared, and spent my night there. The next day I met up with a friend, and I told her what happened and I wanted to investigate, and me and her went through the thicket into the open space. She was scared after the story I told her, but it was daylight, and I went in again, and she stayed out. But I heard the growl again, really loud and really close. It was daylight, but I could hear and not see anything. I know it sounds ridiculous, but it scared the crap out of me and no one believes me. If anyone has any similar story, I would love to hear about it. I'm a Marine, and since being in the military, I've seen some weird stuff. We all have, even the instructors at the School of Infantry. In boot camp at Parris Island, South Carolina, it was around 2 a.m. I was on fire watch and saw an orb go into the roof of a building, but that wasn't the only thing. Months later, I left the island and I went to North Carolina, to the School of Infantry. We were on the grenade range, and our combat instructor told us we would see some weird stuff, but we kind of brushed it off considering we did a 10k hike to the grenade range and just wanted to get some sleep. Later on that night, a few guys on Firewatch freaked out because they saw a little girl running in the woods and kept coming into the perimeter. They said she had a white dress, and I never got to see it, but 6 people told me. Later on, at the end, it was our last range, and we got in trouble. I forget why, but he made the whole squad get on Firewatch instead of just 2 people, and it was pouring down with rain. I had to take a piss, so I jogged across the street, and it's around midnight. I go take a piss and I hear a loud scream. I freeze to listen to see if I heard anything move, and the scream intensified. I took off running and ran towards my buddies, and I said, "Did you hear that?" And they all said they did. Chills went down my spine. It was a rough night to say the least. Whether it was the ghost of the little girl in the white dress, I'll never know, but I was glad to not have to go there again. Oh hey, just quick, before the next story starts, you want to just check if you're subscribed? Most people actually aren't, so, if you want to subscribe and press the bell, that'd be a great help. Thanks. Okay, back to the story. This happened to me when I was a little kid. We lived quite far from my ballet school, and didn't have a car at the time. My brother did an after-school activity as well, like chess club or something, and my mum always came to pick us up around 5. It was winter, and it was already quite dark, although not pitch black yet, when my mum came to fetch me from ballet. She grabbed mine and my brother's hand, and we started making the 20-minute or so journey back home. You could go via the roads, but that would take you about 35 minutes, and we would much rather walk the well-known road which we would take. It was a route that hardly any cars used, and there was a footpath that ran all the way through this forest, past some train tracks, through the rest of the forest, and finally led to our house. As we were making our usual Tuesday return, we came upon a man lying on the floor next to the train tracks. He looked very out of sorts. He was lying on an old, disused mattress and was fast asleep. At least, that was my perception of it. As we walked by, my brother said to my mum, "Hey, we should wake him up. He might get run over by the train tracks." He was dangerously close to them, but assuming he didn't move, surely he'd be fine, I thought to myself. My mother looked at him, said nothing, and pulled us even harder. When my brother asked about the man and that we should wake him up so he didn't hurt himself, my mum said he was probably drunk or homeless, and was afraid, as a woman by herself with 2 young kids, to approach a man who could be in a vulnerable state. Who knows what he would do? My brother at the time, being younger, didn't really see the issue with what my mum was saying and thought she was being out of order, but after a hefty tug, he relented, and we finished our journey home uneventfully. The next day, everyone was talking in town, because apparently a homeless man had been found dead by the train tracks 2 nights ago. It had taken the police some time to discover the man and for the body to be moved. That's when I was a bit confused. "Does that mean we saw a dead man?" I asked my mum and brother. "No, don't be silly," my brother said. "We saw him yesterday, and this was 2 days ago. It must have been someone else." Well, on Thursday, when we were coming back from ballet again, we passed that very same mattress, but there was no one there. Odd, I thought. It was only years later did this really hit me. Were we seeing the ghost of the man? Because apparently he had been found on Sunday night, and we saw him on Tuesday. I don't really have an explanation for what I saw. If anyone can give me some insight, I'd appreciate it. Because as I'd find out, a few weeks after this happened, when I was collecting newspapers to throw in the bin, I managed to catch the picture of the same man who we saw on the mattress in the newspaper. So what does that mean? I really could use some answers. My parents migrated to the city when I was really young. But I've always loved the countryside. My grandparents lived in the countryside, and it was always great to go see them. The problem is, my parents hardly ever had any time off work, and when they did, it wasn't usually enough to make the trip to see them. They lived out in the absolute middle of nowhere, a house surrounded by forest. I don't know how my mum grew up there. It is so isolated, far from the nearest hospital, which is the reason my grandmother perished the way she did, but that's a story for another day. When I was 15, my family were lucky enough that we would be able to go see my grandpa, who was my sole surviving grandparent, for 3 days. The plan was that I stay for at least a week and a half, so that my mum or dad can come and pick me up, sleep the night, and go back. Probably a weekend. I was delighted. I loved being in that rural setting with just nothing about. I loved trying to find bugs and just playing with my grandpa. So off we go. We have an absolutely great car ride. It lasted about 10 hours, and he was so thrilled to see me. As the only grandchild, I also want to say he spoils me. The nearest town is about half an hour away and only has a convenience store as a point of interest. So we're talking super rural here. My parents and I are having a nice time with my grandpa. My grandpa then tells me about the woods and to not venture too far. You see, I hadn't come here since I was 9. We'd only seen him a handful of times when he came to the city, and those were getting few and far between as he was already pushing 80. He tells me that a group of local kids were going to come up and see if we could play together. I was a bit reluctant at first, but the next day, 2 guys come up who are around my age. We hit it off, had some mutual interests, and decided to go exploring, which is why he gave me the warning about the woods. You see, he told me that the woods were haunted, and he advised me not to go very deep into what he called the second section, that it was divided off by some particularly nasty barbed wire, but there were openings as it was quite old now. He told me it was fenced off for a reason. It was private land and that I probably shouldn't go there. I told him I wouldn't, and that was the end of it. My friends and I decided to go explore the woods. They actually knew the area quite well, and we hiked about 2 miles downhill until we made it to one of the forts they'd built. I'm gonna say I was impressed. Apparently one of my friend's parents was a carpenter, and his mother had made this amazing tree house, some cool stairs to go up, and were even trying to get a slide built to exit the tree house. That project was taking a bit longer and it was only half finished, but you could sort of go down and entertain yourself. We played in the fort, talked about girls, and did the usual things 15-year-olds do. Bought some snacks from the village, which we were approaching at that point, and just generally had a good time. I don't know how the topic of conversation came up, but I asked about what was past the barbed wire fence, the alleged haunted section of the woods. My friends laughed and scoffed. They said they'd heard the same things from their folks as well, but took absolutely no notice of their nonsense. That's when I asked if they'd ever been. That's when they looked a little bit more frightened than before, almost like the idea was preposterous. I mean, it might be silly, but you still don't go in. I laughed at them, and I think I hurt their feelings, because one of them said, "Well, it doesn't mean I'm not willing to go." And before we knew it, we were preparing our snacks in a bag and heading off to the forbidden part of the woods. It was only about 2 o'clock at this point, according to my digital watch. The sun was out, it was very bright and very hot, and we were going on a proper adventure. We were laughing and talking the whole way when we found the barbed wire fence. I'm not gonna lie, it took us a long time to find one of the entrances. We were almost losing hope when we found a hole that had been cut at the bottom. Not an official entrance, if you will, but we were scared that if we waited for one, it might be padlocked. And judging from the condition of the barbed wire, it seemed the owner had severely neglected their duties in keeping this place locked up. So, as far as we were aware, it was free access, and we really doubted anyone was going to know that we'd been in or not. As we went in, we noticed we weren't the only ones who had been in there. There were wrappers of sweets and candy bars littered in several places, so we knew that other kids or adults must have used this as a hangout spot at some time. Judging by some of the wrappers and the state of decay they were in, they'd clearly been here a long while. The colour faded from them. One thing I noticed fairly early on was the silence in this part of the trees. Usually, you get the buzz and chirp of birds, crickets, and other wildlife in the area, but it seemed that once we'd passed the fence, or just a bit past it at any rate, all the wildlife seemed to quiet down, like the noise the animals made had been sucked out from around us. I seemed to be the only one who noticed. I was getting a little bit on edge, but my friends were perfectly content to carry on. We looked around, and it looked no different from any other part of the wood we were in. We were all quite confused. There was nothing spooky. We teased out loud, saying that if there was a ghost here, that it should show itself to us to prove it was real. Of course, we saw and heard nothing. We were fine with that. We walked and walked until we found a reasonable-sized clearing, enough for us to put down a picnic blanket and start to have some food and drink. The bag was heavy. We'd taken turns carrying it, and were much happier if we'd eat and drink the contents of the bag to make our load lighter. As we chatted, we pulled out a card game and started playing, and before long we realized we should probably be getting back. It had already turned 5 o'clock. It wasn't anywhere near dark yet, but the canopy of the trees gave the impression that it was darker than it already was. I knew that we'd have a long way home. Thankfully, this area was far closer to my grandpa's house, which, funnily enough, was where my friends were going to be collected. So we knew it shouldn't take us more than about 45 minutes to an hour tops to get back to my grandpa's house, and we had daylight to spare. We were packing everything up when a strange sensation came over us. To this day, I can't even describe it. Like a wave, an invisible wave of something. I felt goosebumps ripple all over my flesh and a chill up my spine. I looked around and didn't see anything at all. So when I looked at my friends to see if they'd felt the same thing too, I was shocked to see they had. They looked at me in bemusement. "Did you feel that?" "Yeah, what was it?" We all shrugged. We were 15, couldn't explain it, and therefore didn't care. We got up, grabbed our picnic mat, shoved everything in the bag, which was, thankfully, considerably lighter, and began walking the way we came. That's when we noticed something. It had gotten considerably darker. We looked up. It looked like it had passed sunset. That was odd. I looked at my digital watch. 5:08. We'd only been about 10 minutes since we finished our games and started packing up. There was no way it could be night yet. I told my friends it was just the tree cover and that we'd come out to glorious sunshine. But who was I kidding? I looked up and I could see stars in the sky. That's when we decided to run. Thankfully, I had a small but powerful flashlight which we used to guide our way. There was enough moonlight, or excess light, I don't even know what was going on at this point, to make it back. We found the hole we had been through no problem and ran all the way back to my grandpa's house in a record 30 minutes. When we got back, my grandpa and these kids' parents were freaking the hell out. We didn't even make it to the house before we found them wandering around with torches in the dark, asking us where we'd been, and furious for us being out so late. I told them that I was sorry, that we just lost track of time and we didn't realize it was dark yet, which was true. None of us could really explain what had happened. The friends' parents looked at them sternly and said a few choice words about playing with us again, which I didn't appreciate, and took them away without another word. My grandpa sat me down after they left and asked me what happened, and expressed his concern and how scared he'd been that something had happened to us out in the woods. I told him the truth, that we had been exploring and that we found a hole in this fence. I carefully admitted that I didn't know it was the section he prohibited me from, and went through, sat down, played some games, and all of a sudden it was dark. We hadn't even realized how. He, with a deep sigh, just said, "Boys will be boys," and said something that really scared me. He told me before that fence was up, when he lived in the neighboring town when he was a boy, he and his friends went into that section of wood a fair few times. But it wasn't until when they were adults and something strange happened, which really made them consider going there again. Apparently there's a shallow body of water somewhere in the middle of that area, and that a young girl had gone to swim by herself. No one had gone with her, and a few days later, when someone's walking around the area, they found her body. The parents, family of that girl had been searching high and low for her, and when they discovered her corpse, they were horrified. They hoped she had just gone away with a friend. Bear in mind, this is like in the early 1900s, so it wasn't uncommon for young women to just go off with their friends. The point is that after the girl passed away, strange things started happening in that area. It was actually owned by one of the local businessmen, the whole forest, and for everyone's safety, after a number of sightings and strange occurrences which people couldn't explain, he erected a wooden fence, which later in his life he replaced with a metal one. The businessman had since died, and his daughter, who inherited the land, hadn't really bothered to put the renovations in place, as she believed it was all rubbish. And apparently if she ever sold the land, she would tear it down willingly, much to the dismay of the town people. And that is why no one was allowed to go there, because of the fear that something might happen to someone in those woods, like the spirit of the girl were trying to take them with her. With that, I was profoundly disturbed, and I never did return to those woods again. I met up with my friends nearly every other day, and we didn't talk about the events, or how time seemed to have slipped away or been robbed from us. We were left profoundly confused. I never saw those guys again, because my grandfather died shortly after. I still wonder though, if I were to go chat with those guys now, would they tell me anything different than what we mutually shared that day? I don't know. I've got more questions than answers at this point. But if anything like this has ever happened to you, I'd love to hear your story. Let me take you back 50 years to a picturesque European escape. There's a house surrounded by forest by the coast. The owners are a very wealthy family, albeit a bit eccentric. The local village know of them as they frequent their establishments to eat, buy food, etc. And for the most part, they're nice enough people. That's when something strange happens. The family don't come into town anymore, which is odd seeing as they need food. 2 weeks go by, 3 weeks go by, and no one's come out of the manor. That's when one of the wife's friends decides to investigate. She thought it was very strange that she hadn't heard from the lady of the manor in a while, and goes off and makes the trek to see her. In order to reach the manor, you have to drive through this forest road for about 40 minutes until you reach the sea. From there, it's just about 5 minutes along this coastal road to get to the big manor. When she got there, the gates were open, and there were no cars anywhere. Had they left? This was very unlike them, as this was their summer home, and they used it every summer, and they were still in the middle of it. That's when she knocks on the door and discovers a horrific sight. There's blood on the floor. She explores the house and finds the decaying body of the husband sprawled on the floor in the dining room. As you can imagine, she's horrified. But where's the wife? Where are the children? She looks around the whole place and doesn't find a single thing. Of course, the police are called and they do a big investigation. It being a small town and everyone being very nosy, soon discover everything there is to know about the family, everything that they'd kept secret for a long time. Apparently, they had some shady connections, which is how they came about their wealth. And due to those shady connections and a souring of relationships, the family were deemed expendable. And instead of terminating the father, who was the one who was doing all the deals, they decided to end all of them. It was quite an ordeal. So this house stood there for the last 53 years abandoned, and the beautiful house, owned by seemingly no one, fell into disrepair and decay. This is where me and my friends show up. Now, I've grown up with this story, and as anyone who can live in a small town will tell you, ghost stories are rife within the teenage population of anywhere that could potentially be haunted. There's always a challenge, a dare if you will, in my town, to spend the night in the decaying manor. Not many people go through with it. They complain that they hear groans and moans and all kinds of stuff during the night and always chicken out partway through. And when I was 17, I was issued this very same challenge from my friends. They wanted me to walk for about 4 hours in the dark, reach the house, sleep there and walk back. I was good. Thankfully, they said we could drive and that we would do it together. So, drive we did. It was a Tuesday evening, I remember that, and there was no school for the whole week. We were going to have a great time. My parents were busy with work and were honestly cool with me doing this, as the town wasn't very big and there wasn't much to do. And my dad, thinking I'd be chicken, knew I'd be back this evening. I went out with my friends, got in my friend's car, and we drove to the manor. The drive was considerably more challenging as the road had been long abandoned and disused, and only rarely did people need to go see it. So, it took us about an hour and a half through tons and tons of foliage, even having to move a small dead tree at one point just to make it to the house. It was clear that this road had been disused for a long time. But when we finally made it, and my eyes looked upon the house, I realized why people were scared of it. The windows were all smashed in. It looked as uninviting as you could get. The paint had been peeling off, and what hadn't been peeled off or destroyed by the salty sea air was going green. Mold coming in from the bottom, green and thick, and from the top. There were only a few walls where the wind and rain hadn't completely destroyed everything. It was a state. I think there were no holes in the roof at least, but even so, I really didn't want to step foot in there. Not because of the ghosts or whatever, but because it looked a really unclean, dirty place, and just having to touch the floor felt like it would be a terrible idea. I went inside with my friends, and we were looking around. One thing I should probably mention is the staircase that they had was made of wood and had long since rotted. I don't think it would have been possible to go up. We explored the house, and that's when my friend found something of interest. In the kitchen there was a small annexing room that you could access through this big wide door, and when you opened it and looked up, there was a small alcove you could just about climb through, and you could clearly see a trap door was still there, embedded in the door. The alcove was just big enough for about one person. You could go up there on your hands and knees and push with your back to try and get it open. My friends and I were desperate to see if this could work, because no one had stepped foot in the upstairs part of the house in a really long time. As you can imagine, humidity, moss, and a bunch of other factors had made this trapdoor almost impossible to budge. I pushed and I pushed with my back to see if I could force it, and that's where we thought maybe there was a lock. We looked and saw no such thing. So my friend jumped up as well. There was just about enough room for him to squeeze in next to me, and he pushed as hard as he could with his back and me with mine until finally we heard a little click. We looked around. My friend got his phone out and looked, and silly as we were, over at the very end, right past our heads, was a small handle. The reason we couldn't see it is because it had been painted over, but our force and pressure had caused it to dangle down slightly. I could see the browning metal underneath the white paint, and my friend managed to sneakily get his hand over and fiddle with it until it pulled free. He twisted it, and with the tiniest amount of effort did we manage to push up this huge hatch. The first thing that hit us was the smell. I don't know why, but it absolutely reeked up there. It was nauseating. But my other friends were too excited to care, and we climbed up through the hatch into this forbidden part of the house. We felt like true explorers, somewhere people hadn't been in literally years. We needed to be careful though. It was already quite dark, and the windows were broken and there was glass everywhere. You could hear the waves crashing against the shore not too far away and smell the salty sea air. We walked around for a little bit. There honestly wasn't much here. I guess after the events that happened in the house, the townspeople might have been curious themselves and had pilfered every article of furniture that was worth taking. There was a decaying bed frame that had rusted almost to oblivion on the floor and brown patches everywhere. The floor was also made of wood, and we were very scared that it was rotting and that we would fall straight through and plummet to our deaths. We treaded with caution. I looked around the room. It had a built-in wardrobe with one of the doors missing as well, and a few etchings on the inside. My friends started exploring other rooms, but I was looking in this child's bedroom. That's when I saw something I think no one had noticed before. There was a wooden panel inside the built-in wardrobe room. Maybe the humidity or rot or whatever had caused it to bend out of shape slightly, because it was clearly visible, at least to me, even in the dying light. I approached it and fiddled with it a bit, but it was stuck good. So I got the corner of my phone out and started banging it from the bottom, and easily it gave way. That's when I moved the panel aside and saw a decaying book hidden behind this secret compartment. I looked inside to see if I could find any other treasure or any other hidden compartment, but alas, there was nothing but this book. I opened it up and started going through a few of the pages. It appeared to be a diary of the young girl who lived here years ago. It was just saying ordinary things about her friends, but then, getting towards the end, there was an entry which I found fascinating. It read something along these lines. "Daddy's going a bit crazy. He said we're not going to leave the summer house, but I don't like the village. I don't have any friends, and we're so lonely here." Another entry read, "Daddy won't let us out the house anymore. He's too scared. Mum says we need to go get food, but he says it's too dangerous and that someone in the village knows. But Daddy don't tell me what they know." The final interesting entry, others being made up of mundane and trivial things, read something along the lines of, "Daddy is refusing to eat. He's sitting by the door with a gun." I felt a bit robbed that the mystery sort of ended there, but I realized I was looking at the last writing of this poor girl who was gunned down unceremoniously for her father's nefarious affairs. That was very sad to know. The family definitely didn't deserve to be punished for what her father did. I decided to put the book back. Something about it made me feel uneasy. I didn't know if I wanted my friends to see it, but I'd been gone a while, and I wondered if they were wondering where I was. I quickly put it back, stuffed the panel back, and decided to try and join them. My friends were having a great time chatting in one of the corner rooms, trying to climb a bookshelf of all things to reach a bird's nest, which had settled long ago at the top of a library. They were cheering him on to try and get it. We were sure that the nest was empty, but they just wanted to retrieve it for whatever reason they wanted to. I couldn't participate in the frivolity, though. I was feeling very strange and very sad. After a while, we decided it wouldn't be worth sleeping there. Honestly, there was nowhere we could have slept comfortably that wasn't covered in grime, dust, dirt, animal droppings, or glass. So we drove back. My dad was right. I was back before long. But that always stuck with me. I don't know what to do. The diary isn't going to exactly help the police find the guys responsible if they're even still alive, but it just left me feeling uneasy. What do you guys suggest I do? I grew up in Orange County, but there were some real wild areas around us, believe it or not. In high school, we went out to this place called Black Star Canyon in the Cleveland National Forest. Big, densely wooded area of oak that stretches from Orange County to San Diego almost to the border. It even contains Marine Corps Base Camp Pendleton. We'd been told it was haunted growing up. Turns out the true story is that there was a tribe up there that was slaughtered in the 1800s by hired fur trappers because they kept stealing the Mexican ranchers' horses for meat. Enough said for a bunch of dumb high schoolers, so we plan a night hike to this place. My friend and I did stuff like this all the time, but I consider myself pretty skeptical, and luckily most of us were pretty level-headed. This area is pretty known for mountain lions too, so we were all on guard and in agreement to turn around at any sign, even if just one of us wanted to. So the way the trail works is that you park at a forestry gate and start to walk down a long, asphalt, narrow road that's mostly dirt from where there were sparse houses in the 50s and 60s before the floods washed them out and the land was committed to the NFS, eventually turning into a full hiking trail. Along this road is a line of barbed wire as well as all kinds of sign warnings that you should not cross. So here we are, typical idiots walking a road on a hardly slivered moon, pitch black after midnight, and not using our flashlights to add to the flare. As we go and venture deeper and deeper down this road, I keep seeing what appears to be a cowboy leaning on the wooden fence post, holding the barbed wire. Just kinda leaning but looking distinctly at us. I'm talking a full-blown cowboy-brimmed hat, just leaning, but it's just a silhouette out of the side of my eye, and every time I look straight on, there's nothing. I'm telling myself I'm logical and push it off as a trick of the light on my eyes, but I keep seeing it every 10 posts or so, but I don't bring it up with the guys. We get to the point where we've been walking for over an hour, and debate on heading back just because of time. Just then my friend goes, "Yeah, and I kept thinking I see a cowboy along the fence." I felt my stomach drop. I couldn't believe it. These were plain wooden fence posts, maybe a typical 4-inch or so, with mostly field behind them, so there's no way it could look like a person. So I open up about it and we all agree to turn around. Just then my other buddy starts flipping out, ripping his shirt off and screaming about getting stung. We're all confused, looking at him like he's crazy, but he insists a bee or something stung him. So we turn out lights from the back and look and watch 3 distinct scratches stretching from one shoulder diagonally to the opposite hip, even drawing a little blood. We were done, needless to say, after that, and we made it back to the car without further incident. You could probably argue the shadow was a coincidence in the dark, and the shapes were playing tricks on us, sure, I'll give you that. But throwing the scratch in a way that we watched happen right in front of us, and he couldn't have done it himself as we were all standing in a circle, I'm not sure what was going on. This area ended up being used by Jack Osborne's show Haunted Highway in his pilot episode. It's pretty cool, and I've been back since, but only during the day. When I was about 13 years old, my siblings and I grew up in a really trashy neighborhood on low income. At the time, it was the best my parents could do. It was full of kids and we hung out in a large group. Tinkley Park was the hangout area for all of us older kids, and we would spend our whole day there, but as soon as the sun went down, it was a ghost town. We heard stories about people living in the woods, traveling around there at night. During the day, we would adventure through the trees, but only to a certain extent. One day, a group of maybe 6 of us wanted to show the rest of us how brave we were, as to venture further than anyone else, so we all agreed, built up the courage and proceeded to jump the park fence, allowing us to get through the one clear big path. The beginning was fun. Having a group made me feel way less nervous because I wasn't the smallest nor the youngest. I always stayed in the middle of the group because the back or front was too intimidating. I was a kid, but I sure as hell wasn't stupid. The first 10 minutes were completely fine, until the air around us didn't feel quite right. A few more minutes of walking, we stumbled upon what looked like a little camp. Food wrappers were scattered, and you could tell a fire had been made a few times at some point. There was also the back of some car seats set up like a bed. That's when we finally realized we were in someone's living space. We all gave each other a look saying, I think we better get out of here, and as soon as that look was made, the group of us all turned to leave, but noticed something in the trees that we hadn't noticed before. A little baby kitten was hanging, dangling in front of our faces. That was it. We took off scrambling, trying to keep our footing without tripping on all the roots of the trees. I don't think I've ever ran and stumbled so much in my life. Once I hit the opening of the park, we didn't stop there. We just kept running all the way past it into our neighborhood to find someone who was willing to hear us. My friend's mum was outside the front yard, so we all panicked and were screaming at her, trying to get out what we all saw. When she realized we weren't playing a prank, she called the cops, and the woods were searched that very same day, almost within the hour, but nothing was found. Not a trace or track that anyone had been in there but us. No campfire, no dead kitten in the tree. We were warned to stay out of the woods after that because of the bear population growing. We knew that wasn't why. We knew what we saw for real. How could 6 of us see it, yet nothing could be found? Was someone watching us? All I do know is that when I got older, our parents assured us it wasn't the bears we should have been scared of all along. That was just what they told us at a young age to keep our minds at ease. Years later, I came across an article that talked about time slips, moments when people accidentally cross into another reality or a past version of our world. Without realizing it, the theory made me stop in my tracks. What if, just for a moment, we weren't in the same woods we thought we were? What if we had crossed into some kind of parallel world, or one that overlapped into ours for a brief moment? The kitten, the campfire, could it have been from elsewhere? That might have explained why they never found anything. And that was the unsettling feeling that haunted me for years, the feeling that someone or something was watching us. Whatever must have lived on the other side knew that we weren't from around there too. Hey guys, it's Mort here and thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed tonight's stories, be sure to let me know. Huge thanks as always to my members and patrons whose names can be seen on screen, and if you'd like to join their ranks for some cool perks, you can find out how in the description. But that's it from me. Watch more things on screen now. I'll see you in the next one. Good night.